And before starting, let me give some information for the webinar. So the event of today will be available both in English and in Italian. Per il pubblico italiano è disponibile la traduzione dell'evento nel collegamento Zoom.
It will be translated in English on Zoom. On the right-hand side of Zoom, you can find an icon of the world interpretation. You click on it and select the language you want. If you're following on the social media, you've got to register via Zoom to get the Italian translation. Now we can start.
And on behalf of Science for Democracy, the Associazione Luca Cosoni and Humans, welcome to our webinar, Defending Academic Freedom. Before leaving the floor to our speakers, let me briefly introduce the three organizers. So Humans is a movement of European citizens for democracy and sustainability. It was launched in 2019 by Italian political activist Marco Cappato, and it's now a community of hundreds of activists and citizens that are engaged in bottom-up political mobilization for socially and democratically sustainable European policies. Associazione Luca Cosoni was founded in 2002 by Dr. Luca Cosoni with the aim to protect the freedom of research and the right of patients and society to fully enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. In 2018, on the wake of the 5th World Congress for Freedom of Scientific Research, Science for Democracy was born to broaden the goal of Associazione Luca Cosoni on an international scale. Since then, Science for Democracy has worked for the promotion of the right to science. The right to science, as defined in Article 15 of the International Covenant for Economical, Social and Cultural Rights, protects the right of researchers to be free and independent, the right of citizens and patients to benefit from the progress of science, and the right to access scientific knowledge. Our work includes activities of advocacy, promotion, and monitoring the right to science worldwide. This webinar will address the issue of academic freedom in a moment in which the UN Committee on Economical, Social and Cultural Rights is in session in Geneva to consider some national reports. Science for Democracy and the Loyola Law School of Los Angeles submitted one parallel report on China in November, and the document was introduced by Justin Small at the committee meeting this morning. The shadow report will be presented later here by another colleague. We would like to acknowledge the attendance of the mission of Switzerland of the UN in Geneva. There is Anna Davitti, the mission of Italy to the UN in Geneva with Angela Zenkel, and the mission of Latvia to the UN in Geneva with Elina Bracira. We thank them for the time and interest. Although academic freedom is not mentioned as such in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 13 and 15, if read together, promote the right to education and freedom of research within institutions of higher education. States have therefore an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill this right. Our webinar will focus on several cases where academic freedom has been under attack. One of our speakers had to cancel for personal reasons. We hope he will be able to join us in the future. We invite you all to stay until the very end of the debate because our friends and partners from Humans will present their podcast on the rule of law, which, among other things, will have a focus on China, one of the topics of today's event. And the microphone goes to Costanza Armanin, researcher fellow at the School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute in Fiesole, visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges, and member of the steering committee of Science for Democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this debate on defending academic freedom. It's a pleasure for me, especially from the institution from which I talk now and for which I'm working at the moment, so the European University Institute, as over the past few years, colleagues here have had to mobilize for two cases of defending academic freedom. The first is the case of CEU, the Central European University. I'm sure we will hear more about CEU later. And the second is the case of a former colleague, Wojciech Sadurski, who was prosecuted in Poland recently for expressing some strong opinions vis-a-vis its own government. So especially because of that, it's a pleasure to join the activities of Science for Democracy, Associazione Luca Cosoni, and Humans on this. But my role stops here. I will briefly introduce the speakers of tonight, and then we will have a first round of comments by them, and possibly also an interactive discussion. Here on Zoom, as you know, you have the possibility to use the chat to intervene. If you want to make me a sign, I'm happy to have a look at the chat. And there is also a Q&A function, which is very useful normally because people you ask questions to can also reply there. So I invite otherwise people to use them. Tonight, we are gonna have interventions by Marco Gentilly, who's the co-president of Associazione Luca Cosoni, and to whom I will give the floor first, from Cesare Romano, who's professor at Loyola Law School and is in the steering committee of Science for Democracy and among the founders. Delny Hester from Loyola Law School as well, discussing Hong Kong. Eva Fodor, who is the co-director of the Central European University Democracy Institute and an associate professor there. Latife Akutz, Einstein Research Fellow at Humboldt University Berlin. Marco Penduca, who is a founder of Science for Democracy. And Federico Brosadelli from University of Naples, L'Orientale, who, as Laura already mentioned, will present the last episode of Humans podcast on the rule of law and China ambition in Europe. I will start by giving the floor to Marco Gentilly. We are going to listen to an audio from Marco, and then we will take it from there. Is it all right? I ask our Regia, if we can go ahead with this.
Porgo i miei più sentiti saluti a tutti coloro che partecipano a questo nostro incontro, così importante per le tematiche da affrontare, visto che la scienza e la relativa libertà di ricerca vanno sempre considerate alla stregua di un diritto umano inalienabile. La stessa nostra Costituzione, nel momento in cui si occupa dei rapporti etico-sociali, afferma: l'arte e la scienza sono libere e libero nell'insegnamento. All'articolo
are free, and their teaching is equally free. This guarantee cannot be ignored, but at the same time, we cannot take these rights for granted. And with our commitment, we must prevent any possible step backwards, a risk that is becoming more concrete by the day. I have first-hand experience of what it means to place limits on research, with continuous ethical constraints that end up hindering the development of a whole series of research strands, such as embryonic stem cells, thus preventing access to the promising results that have been achieved Italy still suffers from limitations imposed by its background, and I use this term in the broadest possible sense, i.e., the set of customs, beliefs, and social influences that affect every moment of our life. It is impossible to even hope for an improvement when faced with a false ethical imperative of protecting life from conception to natural death. So first of all, I make an appeal for secularism, for progress without obstacles and self-censorship, so that science can fully express its potential, so that scientists, academics, and students students are not subjected to external constraints or limited by a general culture of censorship against their work when they defend freedom of expression, which is denied in other areas of the world, and their research work clashes with those principles called inalienable and intangible. These topics, in fact, have nothing to do with faith, but only with the way in which one lives it, and they have nothing to do with specious meddling in matters that concern other nations, but they're just an attempt to guarantee basic human rights for all. With this in mind, I would like to recall the events we have seen in recent months when control over universities has been used as a fundamental instrument of foreign policy, in particular because of the aggressive choices made by the People's Republic of China, whose economic consequences are often only considered in the fields of trade and production. The Chinese Communist Party is seeking to influence the policies of its business partners, starting from universities, not only Chinese universities, by denying the most basic freedom of expression to students and lecturers, through strict control of everything that is said or done within them, and this in every area of the world, even where freedom of expression is a right granted for centuries. This course of action has been pursued with perseverance and determination in order to control and report also in the West whoever condemns the repressive policies of the Chinese regime, exposing them all to the possible consequences and working to ensure that it is the same university in which they are enrolled that censors them, in order not to lose the profitable collaborations with their counterparts in the East, even to the point of threatening to withdraw their students, thus leveraging the loss of their financial contributions. And we should not forget the need to guarantee the safety of those who are in China for study or research purposes. Today, establishing relations with a new superpower means for many accepting its economic blackmail, bending to its will and giving in to the point of turning topics such as respect for human rights or the protection of minorities into taboos. It is therefore clear that the control of knowledge, and above all of those institutions where this knowledge finds theoretical and practical implementation, is still a fundamental objective of all those entities that choose obscurantism instead of progress, and that want to control the minds, to safeguard their power, a course followed for centuries by all forms of authoritarianism. This is why our meeting can only begin with an appeal for the freedom of teaching, research and study, essential preconditions for human progress, which are threatened by repressive policies, denying fundamental freedoms, and by false self-censorship, hiding behind false ethical principles, as grand as they're empty, in the name of an illiberal vision of the world and social relations.
Thank you. We could listen to Marco's intervention. We apologize for the Italian version, which was a little bit more difficult to listen to, but hopefully you could switch to English. And thanks, Marco, for the introduction to our discussion. I would like to give the floor second to another one of the founders and steering committee members of Science for Democracy, Cesare Romano. Cesare is a professor of law. I already mentioned it at the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, LA. I think he has been supervising the parallel reports that Laura mentioned already, which was presented this morning on Hong Kong and academic freedom. I have had the chance myself to work with several mainly American universities with law centers or legal clinics doing human rights activities and assisting courts or international human rights committees in assessing the human rights performance of certain states or in specific cases. The activity that was done with this parallel report is very interesting from my point of view, because the clinics I've been working with have been focusing on gender discrimination, race discrimination, statelessness, and other rights that are more typical here. Is, I don't know if it is the first time, but it's certainly very original to and specific to Science for Democracy to treat and to report on academic freedom and the right to science as a human rights. So Cesare, I will give you the floor for, I would say, maximum of 10 minutes and ideally 7 to keep the bulk going and have a second turn as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Costanza. Good evening, everyone, or good morning if you are in California, as I am. So I've been asked to start by giving you a little bit of more data or information about the normative content of the right to academic freedom. And let me start from the end. So there's no doubt that academic freedom is an international protected human right. But what are the documents that protect it? Well, the right as such is not spelled out in as many words in any international human rights treaty but one. And the only exception is the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which at Article 13 says that academic freedom is guaranteed. If you want to look for the right to academic freedom in the major international human rights treaties, you have to think of the right to academic freedom as a mosaic that is made of several pieces. And what are these pieces? Well, in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you need to look at the freedom of movement, which is very important for academics, which is protected in Article 12, the right to privacy and honor, and not being subject to slander, which is protected in Article 17, the freedom of thought, which is Article 18, the right to hold opinions, which is Article 19.1, the right to express your opinions, which is Article 19.2, and the freedom of association, which is Article 27. This was the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Then you go to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the one that is being discussed today at the United Nations. And you will look at Article 13, which is the right to education, and Article 15, which is the right to benefit from progress in science and technology. So altogether, these pieces make up the mosaic that is the so-called right to academic freedom. Then you can find the same, also all these articles and all these rights, they're echoed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And because you see all the pieces, the components of the right to academic freedom, repeated in Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can possibly say that the right to academic freedom is a universal human right that everyone has in any country, independently from the fact that have or have not ratified either the two covenants. The rights or the component of the rights are also to be found in the various regional human rights regimes. We find them in the Americas, we find them in Africa, we find them in the Arab countries, we find them in Southeast Asia, and we find them, of course, also in Europe, both in the European Convention of Human Rights, which repeats several of these rights that I already mentioned, and as I said earlier, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. And then the right to academic freedom also in national constitutions. Yesterday, while I was preparing for this, I took a look and I found the right to academic freedom listed in 122 constitutions of the world out of 190 states. Indeed, the oldest constitution, to mention it, is the famous Frankfurter Constitution of 1849, so just after the liberal revolutions of 1848, that protect Wissenschaftsfreiheit, so the freedom of knowledge and academic freedom. If you want to have a little bit more of guidance about what these articles means, then there are, I think, five fundamental documents that one should look at. And I think it's very relevant that all these documents have been adopted in the past 10 to 20 years. The first one is the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion published a report in July 2020, so last year, that deals with the question of academic freedom and how the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protect it. The second one to mention is the General Comment 25 by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that was issued in April 2020 that deals with the explanation of Article 15 of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Then always of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, there is General Comment 13 on right to education and General Comment 34 of the Human Rights Committee on freedom of expression. And finally, the last one that I need to be taken into account is the so-called Bonn Declaration of the Ministers of Research of the European Union, which was issued last October, which calls the attention of all member states of the European Union, but also other states that want to sign on to the importance to defend academic freedom. So this was a very quick overview, but it was like kind of a roadmap for anyone who wants to deepen it and interested. So the interesting thing about academic freedom is that a right that can be enjoyed both individually and collectively. It's a right that protects both professors and students. It's a right that protects both persons, students, professors, but also institutions. So the universities themselves or the academic institutions. And it's a right that requires, like every other human rights, the states to do essentially three things. They need to respect it, so they should not take any action directly themselves to violate it. They should protect it, so they should take steps to ensure that other private parties do not violate the right, and they need to fulfill. That means to say they need to create the conditions whereby the academic freedom can thrive and not be violated. I think I've stayed within my allocated time. Just I would say one last thing is that I am thrilled to say that academic freedom has now becoming a center of discussion. As we will hear from our colleagues today, it's unfortunately a right that is under threat and has been attacked in many obvious but also non-obvious ways in a lot of countries around the world. And today we will hear about three specific issues. But because we are paying attention to the right to academic freedom, because we are talking about it, because the bodies that are in charge of supervising the implementation of the treaties where the right to academic freedom is contained are paying attention, are giving their time to explain what this right entails, are providing guidance to states, then we can say that the right to academic freedom is very much alive and thriving. And we need to pay attention because the right to academic freedom is a little bit like the canary in the coal mine. In countries where the right to academic freedom is under attack, it means that something bigger is going on, that democracy itself is under threat. Academics and students have always been at the forefront of social movements and in the new political thinking in the country. They are the ones that are the first one to get in the streets and demand for change. And therefore, they're also the first one that get attacked by those in power who want to maintain the status quo. So we need to pay attention of where the right to academic freedom is violated to know where bigger problems are brewing, and then we can take early action. So this is why people who are tracking the right to academic freedom around the world, a few indexes have been introduced in the past couple of years, are at the front of this, and it's up to us to recall states' attention to the need to protect it. Thank you, Costanza.
Thank you very much, Cesare, for this.
Grazie Cesare per questa presentazione che è stata molto interessante.
End of your intervention concerning the fact that when we see the right to academic freedom threatened is probably the sign of something bigger going on. I think we are going to listen about at least 3 specific examples of this concerning 3 specific countries. And I will start giving the floor to Delaney Hester, who has been working with Cesare at Loyola Law School on the parallel report on academic freedom in Hong Kong, which was presented before the committee this morning. The request time-wise is the same. Delaney, please keep it within 10 minutes, ideally to even less, okay? Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Okay, will do. I am going to start sharing my screen. Give me 1 second.
We cannot see it yet, but we are confident that it will come up.
I'm about to do it. 1 second.
And in the meantime, if there are specific questions, I think that the Q&A function should be open to all the participants who are on Zoom. All right.
Okay. I'm Delaney Hester. I'm a student at Loyola Law School, and I worked on this parallel report with my classmate Justin Small last semester, and we had the help of Professor Romano and also the Science for Democracy. The subject of our report is Hong Kong's new national security law, and we found in our research that it poses serious risks to academic freedom. China ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 2001 and declared it applicable in Hong Kong as well. As a result, both states are obligated to follow this commitment and uphold and protect academic freedom. We found that this law poses threats in 2 major ways. The first is that it violates academic institutions' right to autonomy, which is a precondition to academic freedom. Academics and students are often expressing views through their research or in a personal capacity that threaten the state and or private actors. And institutions should remain autonomous and free from influence by these other parties in order to allow academics to continue expressing these ideas. And one example of how this autonomy has been reduced, and one that we've seen in the context of this national security law, is through external interference in the selection, appointment, and dismissal of leadership within academic institutions. We've also noticed that this law has the effect of chilling academic expression. As written, the law is quite broad and fails to define the precise conduct that leads to a violation. As a result, academics and students alike are afraid to express views that might lead to a violation. The law imposes life imprisonment, so it's not worth the risk. And this is exactly when we need academics and citizens engaging in public debate and discourse, putting pressure on the state, and as well as the international community to do more. And China has a background on eroding academic freedom within its own borders. In 2014, Professor Ilham Tohti was arrested, tried, and sentenced to life for expressing his views on issues facing the ethnic Uyghur community. And Professor Yang Shozeng was fired for criticizing the central government's economic policy. And there are countless other examples of professors who are punished for expressing views that are critical of the central government. In recent years, though, China has been exerting more influence over academic freedom within Hong Kong. The Global Public Policy Institute cited Hong Kong as one of 10 countries in the world showing a statistically significant deterioration of academic freedom within the last 5 years. And one way China's been able to do this is through influencing the chief executive. The chief executive of Hong Kong is the chancellor of Hong Kong's government-funded universities. And while this is mostly a ceremonial role, the chancellor is able to appoint members to the University Council at the University of Hong Kong. And the University Council manages the university's financial and human resources decisions. Recently, we saw Professor Johan Chan, an outspoken democracy advocate who has vocally opposed the central government's growing control over Hong Kong, recommended for the pro-vice chancellor position at the university. He was unanimously approved by a selection committee, but ultimately the University Council deferred voting on his appointment and rejected it. Similarly, the council dismissed Professor Benny Tai after he was sentenced to 16 months imprisonment in connection with his participation in pro-democracy protests. Prior to the University Council's decision, an independent university body concluded that his conduct didn't warrant dismissal. So we don't have conclusive evidence that both of these professors were punished as a result of their views, but we can make the inference that that in fact was the case. So in addition to China eroding academic freedom within Hong Kong, we also had China growing frustrated with Hong Kong's inability to pass a national security law. Hong Kong is mandated to do so in the basic law, but attempts to do this through the normal democratic process were met with mass protests and criticism because citizens were afraid that their rights were being infringed. So China, likely frustrated, wrote and enacted the national security law that's the subject of our presentation today without releasing it, and did so unilaterally. And once the text of the law was released, it raised more concern. The bill's most alarming provisions introduced severe punishment, including life in prison for acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign or external forces, all under the guise of safeguarding national security. And as mentioned, it fails to define the precise conduct that leads to a violation. It also limits Hong Kong's authority to interpret, apply, and enforce the law. Some specific provisions that raise additional concern. The law introduces the Office for Safeguarding National Security, which has the authority to investigate national security matters that are too complex due to foreign involvement or external forces, situations where the Hong Kong government is unable to enforce the law, or major threats to national security. These categories are quite broad and could encompass nearly everything. It also established the Committee for Safeguarding National Security, which appoints law enforcement personnel and judges and is advised by a delegate from the central government. It also established a branch of the Hong Kong police force that conducts surveillance without consulting judicial authority. It supersedes all local laws, which would further limit Hong Kong's judiciary's ability to interpret the law. And specific to academic freedom, it authorizes the Hong Kong government to carry out supervision and regulation over matters concerning national security, including those relating to schools and universities. It mandates that Hong Kong shall promote national security education within schools and universities, and which enables Hong Kong's government to take over the curriculum, determine what is being taught and how, and also penalizes professors and other personnel who fail to comply. It names the chief executive as the head of the Department of Safeguarding National Security, and also establishes extraterritorial jurisdiction, which asserts that the law applies to conduct that takes place outside of Hong Kong, committed by persons who are not from Hong Kong or China. And since we submitted our report, we've seen more examples of how this law is being applied and enforced. As of March 2nd, 2021, so just last week, Hong Kong has made over 100 arrests. And we saw 47 opposition activists, including Benny Tai, charged with conspiracy to commit subversion for taking part in an unofficial primary election. These 47 activists face life in prison if found guilty. And Hong Kong recently unveiled new guidelines for lower level students, which aim to develop a sense of belonging and a sense of responsibility for safeguarding national security. These guidelines cut the time for liberal studies in half, which is a course that nurtures critical thinking. And officials have said that the new curriculum should teach facts, but should not ask students to analyze them. And Hong Kong's education minister asserted last week that Hong Kong University's curriculum must reflect this new law by next semester, and that universities should be prepared to help prevent and suppress acts that could violate the law. Schools were told to call police over grave or emergency situations, such as pupils staging protests, forming human chains, or displaying separatist slogans on campus. We find this super concerning because schools are being forced to prioritize their legal obligations under the law over protecting students and faculty and upholding the right to academic freedom. We saw Chinese University cut ties with its 12-member student union after citing concerns that the group's manifesto and public comments breached the law. The school asked the cabinet to register as an independent body and to assume its own legal responsibility going forward. And additionally, the first defendant awaiting trial will not receive a jury. So ultimately, this law violates both China and Hong Kong's commitments under international law. Both nations are obligated to uphold the covenant of economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to academic freedom. And while the law acknowledges this obligation, the provisions do nothing to uphold the principles contained in the covenant. We asked the state delegation to hold China accountable for what happens in Hong Kong under the guise of national security, and argue that students and professors should be left alone and that academic institutions should be given back their autonomy as mandated by the covenant. Okay, thank you.
Very much, Delaney, and you managed actually to keep the time, and thanks for going into this depth. I think there is we have been talking a lot about Hong Kong and the security law during the past year, that this is an aspect that didn't get so much media attention, whereas it's such a crucial aspect, and as was said before, is yet another sign of the crackdown that is ongoing. But
Costanza, if I may, since that this report was discussed this morning at the United Nations, maybe I should give an update to everyone for the benefits of those who couldn't be there. Is that Delaney's colleague Justin Small presented the report to the committee. And I have to say that we are very happy to say that they really paid attention to what we were saying. They took notes, and they even asked questions, which for anyone who's familiar with the process, it's not usual. So that means that actually we caught their attention, at least on Hong Kong. So that's very good.
Indeed, this is very good to hear. Thanks, Cesare, for the updates, and hopefully those who have missed our participants tonight will be able to check the report, which is available online from the website of Science for Democracy. We move from Southeast Asia back to closer to closer to home, Europe. And with the next speaker, whose name is Eva Fodor, thanks Eva for being here, we move to Central European University, which is a case in itself, an academic institution that had to move from one place to another in recent years. Eva is at CU. She works on issues that are very close to my heart, like gender studies, human rights, and migration. I'm very happy to be able to interview. And I think that maybe the case of CU has been the one recently that has come more to the forefront of the attention of the media, to the list in Europe, but it's very nice for us to have a direct testimony of this, and obviously you're very welcome also to comment further on the introduction that Cesare said and on the mission of Science for Democracy, which we all hope you can join from now on. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. It is really a great pleasure and an honor to be here and to be able to talk to you about my university. I can't agree more with Dr. Romano about the point that he made about the connection between academic freedom and other types of, and the violation of other types of freedoms. And I think CEU and the story that I will tell you is a good example. So the Central European University is in Hungary, and I need to give you some background because in the past 10 years, Hungary has been one of the most spectacular examples of democratic backsliding within the European Union. And the EU has attempted to sanction Hungary a number of times, and in fact sanctioned, or at least fined Hungary a number of times for violating principles of the rule of law and various other basic civil rights issues. But none of these changed the course of the government. But one such instance when the country went straight against the will of the principles and the ideas of the European Union was the case of the Central European University. And I will just now tell you the story and tell you what happened. And I'm happy to share, I'll give you the broad outline, and I'm happy to share more details. I was at that time one of the pro-rectors of CEU, which is sort of the dean of the faculty. So I was thrust in the position of being involved in CEU Spite on a daily basis. So I have plenty of information. I just don't want to bore you with all the details. So CEU, Central European University, is a small college and a small sort of US accredited graduate school. We were accredited both in the United States and in Hungary, and teaching mostly social sciences in Budapest. The university was founded in 1991 by a number of Central European intellectuals, with the goal of educating the generation, the post-transition, post-communist generation in social sciences. And the funding for the university, and this is important, came from George Soros. Now, in the 15 years of its existence in Hungary, CEU grew to be one of the best universities, in fact, the best university in the disciplines that we're teaching in Hungary. And it, had been working legally in the country without any conflict with the authorities. As I said, it's a small university. We have about 1,500 students, but they come from all over the world, from 120 countries. We are actually the second most international university in the planet. So all of this, so you need to know this about Hungary and this about the CEU to understand what happened. So what happened was that in the spring of 2017, the Hungarian government passed a modification to the higher education law, which came to be named Lex CEU, basically modified the higher education law and introduced a number of new criteria for universities that were accredited or that were foreign owned or that were accredited in foreign countries, two of which were targeted CEU specifically. And those two were one, the new modification said that universities functioning in Hungary, foreign universities functioning in Hungary, needed a federal level or a national level agreement between the foreign country where they were accredited and Hungary. That was one. And the second was that foreign accredited universities had to pursue educational activities in the country where they were accredited. And now CEU did not pursue educational activities in the United States. There are a number of American universities that do not, so that operate in foreign countries that do not actually have a campus in the United States. The Hungarian government gave the deadline of October. This was passed in April. We had until October to do something about it. Otherwise, the threat was that these universities would lose their operating license. There had been no consultation with CEU. This came out of the clear blue sky. There had been no sort of warning really, other than sort of vague political threats against George Soros. And again, as I said, there had been no legal problems or academic or intellectual problems that the authorities had notified us about. The deadlines were, of course, punitive, and the law itself was extremely discriminatory, because really it was only CEU that had problems satisfying these two requirements in Hungary. So this was clearly a political attack against an excellent American, US accredited university, and of course, an attack on academic freedom globally. It is important to know that this, of course, in a Hungarian context, this was not completely, it was not the first act of curbing academic freedom, because the Hungarian government had been attacking local universities as well, only not as spectacularly as CEU. So after this the modification of this the law, we tried to fight the government, tried to negotiate, tried to at least get a clear understanding of what the law is. A huge international support campaign followed, and we received support, and the Hungarian government received letters from over 650 universities and a variety of professional associations. So there was quite a lot of support for CEU, Nobel Prize winners, the US State Department, etc. In fact, the European Commission also started infringement procedures against Hungary. Hungary responded, this whole process started and went on and on and on and on. And eventually the case went to the European Court of Justice. And I'll come back to this. In the meantime, it was very clear that if we wanted to keep CEU functioning, then we needed to try at least and satisfy these two requirements. So we did, because CEU had a long-term collaboration with Bard College. We actually started an education MA program jointly with Bard in the United States. So we and which then was accredited as such by the American authorities, and the Hungarian authorities were notified. So we thought that we had satisfied this criterion. In fact, the Hungarian authorities themselves had said that we had satisfied this criterion. The second criterion was to have an agreement, an international agreement between Hungary and, in our case, the state of New York, where CEU was accredited. So we helped negotiate this agreement with the governor of New York, who was very keen on signing this agreement. And the Hungarian, and so there was negotiation between the Hungarian government and the governance of the state of New York. And this agreement was produced on paper. Very similar agreements were signed with other states in the United States, which had universities operating in Hungary. But the Hungarian government simply refused to sign the CEU's agreement. And that was the end of the story. So basically, with that, CEU could not satisfy the requirements of the new law, because we did not have this agreement, because the Hungarian government refused to sign the agreement. So essentially, the government forced CEU to leave the country, did not allow CEU to operate according to the new regulations that it passed. Now, my university is fortunate because we're a private college, a private school, a private university with a significant endowment. And that endowment allowed us to move to Vienna, so to leave Hungary and move to Vienna. So last year, we moved all our educational activities in Vienna. We have beautiful, beautiful buildings in Budapest, where right now we're operating a Democracy Institute, a research institute of which I am now one of the co-directors. The reasons are manifold. First of all, we want to utilize the buildings, and we want to research democracy, because I think it's really important. It's particularly important to do in Budapest. And also we want to make sure that something about CEU remains in Budapest. So CEU will survive, in fact, will thrive in Vienna, but it is important that Hungary has employed political persecution to force other universities to give up a great deal of their autonomy. It is, in fact, the government is, in fact, in the process of changing the governance structure of a number of Hungarian universities, and appointing government, so pro-government people to basically manage the universities instead of the senates or instead of the university, the autonomous university leadership. In the midst of all this, the Hungarian government also, for example, banned the gender studies MA programs in Hungary. And even though there had been 2 Hungarian accredited MA programs, those could not function and cannot function any longer. Now, in terms of CEU, there's one more sort of act to the story. The European Court of Justice finally, in the fall of 2020, made a decision and basically agreed that the Hungarian higher education law violated European principles, not so much the principle of academic freedom, because apparently this is something that states, the nations themselves have to regulate, but in other ways found invalidated this piece of legislation. But of course, this decision came about 2.5 years too late, and the Hungarian government has still not been forced to do anything about it. So the law is still in place. Technically, it's invalid, but the university had to leave already. There's no way back for us. So it has been a very shocking experience for all of us. Not only did we all have to move our lives to Vienna, but to witness the arbitrary persecution of a university for political reasons, and the fact that we were completely helpless. Neither the United States with the Trump presidency, so we didn't get much help from the United States with Trump at the helms, and neither did we get much. I mean, we got a lot of emotional and intellectual support from the European Union, but nothing that would actually have saved this university. And I think that's a huge problem, and that is something that we need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for this report. Although it is a very sad story, it is important to make it as known as possible. Some years ago, we mobilized with pins in support of CEU, but the international network of scholars doing this wasn't powerful enough to provoke any change. By the way, mentioning this, I also remind everybody that there is a network of academic institutions, a network called Scholars at Risk that you can Google and find, which covers some hundreds higher education institutions in a number of countries, which is interesting to join, so that these cases can be reported, and hopefully something can be done around this. Now, CEU probably also suffered the Soros syndrome in Hungary and was a target. And was a target for this. This said, also the judges, NGOs, and asylum seekers were targets of similar laws at the same time. And unfortunately, the Court of Justice of the EU was just as powerless as in the case of academic freedom. So it's a further point that needs to be kept in mind while we try to construct a federal European Union which can ensure the respect of fundamental rights. But going always close to the EU, I would like to switch our attention to Turkey and to give the floor to another person, Latife Akiuts, who herself has been, just as in the case of Eva, forced to move away. I mean, to leave not her country. Eva didn't have to leave her university because the university moved, whereas in the case of Latife Akiuts, it's also a case of moving away from Dutch University, which I think is not far from Istanbul. And I would like to give her the floor to tell us a little bit of this experience. And I was just noting that also Latife is a scholar working on gender and migration issues. So the cohort is large here. And I'm happy that you are also so sensitive to this kind of issues. Thanks, Latife. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Costanza. Can you hear me? Unfortunately, it's been 4 years. I cannot work on any issues on gender and border because of talking about this academic freedom and attack on academic freedom. But I will come back this soon. And I would like to share my screen if possible.
Yes, 1 second. Okay, yes.
Is it fine now? Oh,
yeah. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, before you start, can you just make the wide screen presentation?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just okay.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to start by showing 2 images, which gives a very good idea of state attack on academic freedom in Turkey. The first one, this picture is from February 2017. On that one, you see that Turkish riot policemen walk over academic gowns laid down during a protest against the dismissals of academics for peace from Ankara University. It was with decree law, and with this decree law, more than 100 academics for peace lost their job. And the second one, this one is the latest one from January 2021. In that one, it's from Boğaziçi University. The police attacked and tear gassed Boğaziçi University students and handcuffed the gates of the university to prevent students from entering their own campus. Those students were protesting appointment of the rector directly by President Erdogan. Actually, these 2 pictures have become a symbol of attack on academic freedom and academia in Turkey during the last 5 years. The purge and pressure on academic freedom obviously has a long history in Turkey, but because of our time burden today, I'm going to talk about the period after January 2016, when Academics for Peace group made their peace petition public, and more specifically about the state of emergency process after failed coup attempt in Turkey in July 2016. Let me briefly explain who Academics for Peace group are and why we have targeted and punished so harshly by our own state. This is a group of academics who got together first in 2012 to support political prisoners' hunger strike in Turkey, but become widely known after peace petition entitled "We Will Not Be a Party to This Crime." Our declaration, this is from our press meeting in 2016, January 11th. What we said in that petition and why they attacked us so harshly, it's because this declaration aimed to urge Turkish state to stop the human rights violation in Kurdish provinces, mainly caused by curfews, which affected thousands of civilians. And we asked the state to start the peace process again and immediately for a peaceful resolution. This petition signed by 2,212 academics and researchers from 89 universities of Turkey and also received international support. Hundreds of non-Turkish citizen academics and intellectuals signed this petition. On January 12, one day later, after making our petition public, the President Erdogan made a speech, public statement, on the peace petition, and he called us, the signatories of this petition, as so-called academics, dark brains, colonialists, traitors, and he stated that no one who is against the unity of the country can serve as a public officer. And those traitors, here us, should be punished as soon as possible. After that speech, all over the country, public prosecutors immediately took legal action, starting investigations with criminal charges based on the accusation of making terrorist propaganda, which means 1.5 years of imprisonment. In some cities, academics were taken into custody from their homes, subjected to home and office search, and seizure of personal items. We started to face all kinds of attacks, also coming from individuals, not only from state institutions. University administration also started disciplinary investigations against us. Let me briefly talk about my own experience. When I signed, my own story has started very same day and Erdogan's hate speech. When I signed the petition, I was working in Düzce University as an assistant professor in sociology department. And I was the only petitioner in my university. Actually, this made me an easy as a single woman living alone in this conservative city. My university was the first one who took the legal action, and they suspended me in 2 days. And I have been targeted by local media and TVs by using my pictures on their first pages, and also by ultranationalists through their social media accounts. You could imagine the severe words, insults, and threats in that post. Some was asking for my address. Some others were trying to reach me by calling my faculty. And I had a home and office search by the police. And then the local prosecutor put an arrest warrant. And then I was detained and then released with a travel ban. It was not safe at all to stay in that small city. I was total target of ultranationalists. And it took 3.5 days. I had to left my cat behind and all my belongings behind, and I moved to Istanbul. But this is my personal story, but lots of my friends, my colleagues went through the same processes. This was the only beginning of the purge, actually. After failed military coup d'etat, it was only the attempt, actually, become a catalyst for another much broader attack on academic freedom in Turkey. After this failed attempt, AKP government declared state of emergency, and similar to what every authoritarian state does, first targeted academics, journalists, politicians, actors, writers, directors, shortly intellectuals who produce oppositional art and critical information. Let me give some numbers. Since then, 8 colleagues of us, Academics for Peace, were imprisoned in different time periods of for at least 40 days. 549 petitioners were dismissed or forced to resign or retire. 406 of them were dismissed with decree laws declared during this state of emergency. which means lifelong abandonment from the labor market through black civil services. It means passport canceling, denial of pension rights, and exclusion from the labor market through blacklisting of national insurance number. If you are in that list, it means you cannot work anywhere, not in a restaurant even. And we call that being civil death, actually. This is the actually most life-affecting results of this process. The petitioners have also been suspended from their academic life. After my dismissal with a decree law in October 2016, I got another travel ban, passport canceling, and I have to leave the country because there was no way to stay there and live there, actually survive there. And now I ended up in Germany and as an exile academics, let's say. It is a long story of exile academics, and now in Europe we are more than 200 academics for peace, as you imagine. And the saddest story is one of our dear colleague, Mehmet Fatih Traj, who discharged from Çukurova University and was not accepted by any other university, could not stand this injustice, and he committed suicide. And it's sometimes very difficult to talk about all these issues, but yeah. As I told at the very beginning of my speech, the history of Turkish universities regarding freedom of thought and expression has never been perfect, but this time the extent of suppression, which has begun with the petition and become systematic after the failed coup attempt, has enlarged so much that, and it has already gained its place in the history of Turkey and also academia all over the world. Please interrupt me if I exceed my time, because there is a lot to say about Turkey.
You have a couple of minutes left, but it's really interesting. So please finish your intervention.
Okay. During the state of emergency, for example, AKP government used these decree laws as a tool, and more than 15 universities have been shut down, and more than 7,800 academics lost their position in the universities. And with 2 decree laws, I really want to mention these 2. One, also universities lost their autonomy and academic freedom to decide and elect their own rector. From now on, it will be appointed by President of Erdogan Republic, but let's say Erdogan. What is happening in Boğaziçi University currently, it's the most obvious outcomes of these decisions and implementations of these new regulations. And if there is any question, I can give some more details in Q&A section. But considering academic freedom and quality of academic works, those decisions, after that, those decisions, the institution of higher education in Turkey do not only lose their autonomy, but also the quality of teaching, researching, and learning. The universities lose their qualified academics by these dismissals, for example, resignation and retirement. And the repression is felt both not only in private universities, also public universities. And the universities rector act as dictators and helped the government to dismiss academics from universities, for example. They even begin to control the papers to see whether they include of the current government and its actions, let's say. And all these pressures, penalizings, controls on academic works at first step have caused decrease of the quality of higher education, decrease of critical thinking on the grounds of the and self-censorship, decrease in the number of academic publications and projects, and also disappearance of competence as the principal criteria for academic career. And we know that this pressure against academics for peace and against academia has its own local conditions in Turkey, but we also know that it corresponds to the general rise of right populist policies and anti-intellectualism worldwide. And the experiences of Academics for Peace group are not consequences of just one single state's anti-democratic politics, rather a long-standing story of precarization and neoliberal politics of the world system. And therefore, we need to discuss all these things in academia all over the world, and we need to take an action together. That's why international solidarity and taking international actions is the life-saving for us as an academics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Latife, for this call and for flagging Academics for Peace. I think we all need to be well aware of the existence of the networks like Scholars at Risk, but also Science for Democracy. I think is a good candidate to represent a network of people and academics who care about academic freedom, the quality of education, as you were saying, and the human rights to science. I would also like to take on your call to keep discussing this, and also in other countries. I was just discussing with Marco Perduca about the opportunity to maybe have other sessions and inquire also about other countries. It could be Brazil, for instance, it could be Poland. There are many countries in the world of which we could discuss, unfortunately. Having said this, let me pass the conduction of this of the workshop to Marco Perduca himself, who's a founder and the main animator of Science for Democracy. He will moderate the Q&A session. Thanks, Marco. So as I just worked in the chat, you can start asking questions there. Marco, please.
Thank you, Costanza. Thank you all for all the speakers. We already have a question, but before getting into the question, I'll ask Federico perhaps to wait until the round of answers to make his presentation. I am very happy to not only to have heard what we've heard, even if they're all sad stories, because I've spoken at the Ankara University, at the CEU University in Budapest, and I've been to Hong Kong. I haven't spoken at their university, but I was there during the Umbrella Movement week of October 2014. And the major chunk of those that were taken to the streets were students, sometimes from junior high, but certainly high school and university, and they were the backbone of the pro-democracy movement. On top of the national security law, as you might have read a couple of days ago, also the electoral system has gone under major counter reforms. So what was at the center of the mobilization 7-8 years ago for universal suffrage is now becoming a real problem in other situations. And what Cesare said, that you start in a little part of human experience, which in this case is academic freedom. And then you see little by little democracy becoming the victim of other activities, and what has been happening both in Hungary and Turkey to a certain effect are unfortunately following the same path. Well, we have a first question from Arianna Pilastro, and then I will ask also Giulia Perrone to check if elsewhere there's other question being asked. This is, I was wondering if Eva Fodor can briefly comment on the ECJ judgment about CEU of last October. I think she would, but perhaps not everybody was already with us. Which do you think will be the followings or the follow-up to that decision? And this, I think, is also a question that I would like to ask to Latifes, because if Hungary has at least had a decision taken by a jurisdiction on some aspect, even if not necessarily concerning freedom of academic freedom, the Turkish students and academia have taken to the streets with very original ways of non-violence resistance against what the government and the president, I would say, most of all, have done against themselves. And then perhaps if Cesare also has additional ideas on how, on top of going before the United Nations, as thanks to him, the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and Science for Democracy have done this morning, there are other ideas to pursue free academic freedom in jurisdiction or quasi-jurisdiction. But first, Eva, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Unfortunately, this decision really came way too late for CEU. CEU has moved because it could not admit new students in Budapest. So we moved to Vienna. University now is functioning in Vienna. And this piece of legislation really only impacted and specifically targeted CEU. So there is no other university to whom this decision makes any difference whatsoever. So CEU is not in a position to fight for the actual implementation of or a response from the Hungarian government, and no other university are likely to do that either. So basically, what will be the impact of the ECJ decision? I don't know. Nothing has been this. This was decided in the fall, and nothing has happened since. The Hungarian government has not made a move, and it might take another 2 or 3 years for various commissions or committees in the European Union bureaucracy to come after the Hungarian government. But by then, this will make no difference whatsoever. So I'm actually quite skeptical about the usefulness or sort of the usefulness of this process and the support that this process could provide to people in to countries who could or universities who may find themselves in similar situation later.
If I may add another follow-up question to this, which will also be valid for Latife, what is the popular attitude towards this governmental decision? Was everybody taking the side of the independent university being punished, or there was a 50-50 split among political party line?
We didn't poll the popular opinion. This is a small university, and it really impacted a very small number of people. But certainly it impacted Hungarian intellectuals, because CEU was one of the important intellectual forces, and we have a library that's the largest social science library in the region, not only in Hungary, which is also, again, is also moving to Vienna. So for a variety, and CEU organized events and had courses, etc., that were of interest to Hungarian academics. So we got a lot of support from Hungarian academics, Hungarian intellectuals. There was a large-ish protest in Budapest, large for Hungary. About 80,000 people protested in one weekend in the streets of Budapest, demanding that the president of the republic does not sign the law into effect. He did. And then there were a few other smaller protests. But in general, so in terms of public opinion, all I can tell you is that this happened in 2017. A year later, the same government was re-elected with a 2/3 majority into power. So, and of course, the issue of, we try to keep CEU and this problem and the problem of academic freedom more broadly speaking in the news, but that did not seem to have swayed the electorate.
Well, we know that both Hungary and Turkey have a very complicated electoral system where you may win in big cities and lose the general election in the countryside or in the periphery of the country. And so that's another subject for another webinar, but I guess no, there was at least some debate, and 80,000 people is a lot of people in a small countries like Hungary. Latifa.
Yeah. Our case was a bit different than the Central European University case because the Academics for Peace was talking about peace and directly involving in the politics, which is the most conflicted one in Turkey, let's say, because the government punished us that harshly because as an academics, as an prestigious, as an academics who has a prestige in the society, was talking about the Kurdish problem. And the reaction was so harsh because they were saying that how dare you to talk about the Kurdish issues? You have to just stay in your offices, in your universities, on the wall of the universities, and just talk about that. We were doing kind of activism, and that's why the government couldn't stand on that. But we got lots of support from very different groups and communities, like. There was a group of Peace for Everyone group, and it involved like theater players, writers, directors. I don't remember exactly, but more than 20 different groups supported us, and also our students. And but then there was this accusation of doing terrorist propaganda. And actually at the end, we all acquitted from that charge, but it didn't change anything for us. I mean, still our passports are canceled. Still we cannot work in any university, any research center, any institution, and even any restaurants, let's say. And we cannot go back to our job still. This is valid. But then AKP government decided to implement this decree law and appoint a new rector to the Boğaziçi University. Thanks to our students and our colleagues in Boğaziçi University, they are resisting. I don't know, from here, it's really difficult to talk about that because I missed being there. I missed being with them, and they are resisting in every manners by using peaceful tools. I mean, they are on the streets and police attack them. They were imprisoned. 11 of students are in prison during that process, and 25 of them got home prisoning, something like that. And still they are resisting, and they don't accept this new rector. And they every day in the campus, they are doing demonstration, not only students, also our colleagues. Thanks to this government, actually united us in the universities. Before it was not like that. Before, I mean, there were some professors and, faculty members, there were students, and there were some administrative workers, but now they are united and they are resisting together. This is something gives really, really big hope to us as well, to be able to go back to our country, let's say.
Thank you. I think what you call peaceful, we call nonviolent, because they actually use specific techniques that we have learned from the Turkish movements of Gezi Park, the so-called Duran Adam, that people standing immobile and being in front of the police or the authorities, so to speak, they want to take their stand in a very violent and assertive manner. Cesare.
Thank you, Marco. So I was just I was listening to these presentations, and were really heartbreaking in many ways. Something that struck me is that there is very little international jurisprudence on the question of academic freedom. Very rarely academics or who suffer from violation of the human rights bring the matter to courts, and even less to international courts and tribunals. As I was listening, and actually I sent a couple of personal messages to some of the panelists asking for a chat afterwards, we would be happy to help you turn the situations into cases. And I think it's important to do that because the problem with international human rights is that sometimes these are abstract principles that need to be applied in concrete situations. And the magic of litigation does exactly that. It takes some very broad abstract principles and applies them to real situations on the ground. And by doing that helps clarifying the content of the rules and the scope of the rules. But also by doing that, it creates an echo effect that helps reinforcing the rules, right? And then perpetuating them and bringing them forward, because it creates new cases that can be cited later on in support of the existence of the rules. So there is both a personal reason for doing that in order to find justice, so to speak, but there's also a very important public dimension to that that is somehow still missing. And to the extent that is possible, I encourage everyone to start thinking in terms of litigation. And to the extent that is possible, we will be happy to help you with that.
Sorry. There's another court that could be called into action, and that also has jurisdiction over Turkey, the European Court of Human Rights.
Of course, there's in the specific case of Turkey, I was thinking about two possible avenues. One is the European Court of Human Rights, of course. The second one is Turkey has ratified the optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on Individual Communications. So that would be the Human Rights Committee. In the case of Hungary, that would be, of course, the European Court of Human Rights. There would be also the possibility of optional protocols. So there's a number of possibilities there. Then, of course, there are technical requirements. They're different from each and every one, but it's something.
Thank you. Whenever please go ahead.
Considering European Court of Human Rights, actually, we took some of the cases to there. And let me explain what happened in state of emergency and after this decree law. It was not only the academics, also lots of civil servants, more than 200,000 civil servants lost their job. And some of them took their cases to European Court of Human Rights, but they rejected. I mean, I know at least two files rejected by this court because they were saying that you have to finish all the internal process in Turkey and then you can come here. But there is a trick there. Turkish government during the state of emergency, they founded a new institution, let's say, State of Emergency Commission, let's say, who has supposed to be take care of all these files and our files who dismiss with decree laws and then finish the process. And then it's a mediator actually, but they don't work. It's been more than 4 years. They don't do any work. They don't take care of any cases, any files. And when we go to court, European Court of Human Rights, they say that you have to go through this commission first to finish the internal process. This is the problem in our cases, because they're afraid of having more than 200,000 of files in their courts. That's the problem, actually.
Thank you. There's another question that has been Maria Jose Ruiz Alvarez is asking, if I understand it correctly, how governments can exercise the sort of a power of control. And I think this is a question on Turkey, because Turkey is part of some European funded research programs, and perhaps the European countries can put pressure from what they do on Turkey in order to change their policies. Now, if one were to learn from the Hungarian experience, one would say that there's not much action taking place on some topics, but I am sure that also the group of students or academics from Turkey have tried to reach out to other European colleagues and perhaps also the European institutions. I don't know how many how much European money is being invested in research or in joint program within the EU and Turkey. But if there's anything has been done along those lines to try and ask the European institution to put pressure on Turkey, could you let us know?
I don't know the exact amount of money, but I know quite a lot. And but the problem is when we try to ask for example, academic boycott, our European colleagues and institutions rejected that. I mean, they have really close tie with Turkey and with Turkish institutions, and they continued this institutional ties with universities who take a really hard action against academics for peace. But okay, of course, there is some other institutions just protest the universities and didn't want to do any academic events and conferences in Turkey, but they didn't clearly stated that we are, for example, we don't want to do our conference in Turkey because of this situation. They just said we have a security problem and that's why we are not doing this year, and we just canceled. The problem is but this doesn't affect our government at all. I mean, any pressure, any statement from the European institution. But still, it's really important for our colleagues who are still in Turkey and who cannot leave the country. It's really important for them. We here in Germany, for example, we founded a university to be able to find a way for our colleagues who stayed in Turkey and who cannot leave the country to give them some survival money, for example. They are doing online courses there. But this is just with our effort in an institutionalized way. It's really difficult here. We have to fight this, let's say, Western centralized democracy understanding. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Delany, we don't want to exclude you from this discussion. So if you have anything to add, not only to your presentation or to the debate that's going on, now would be the good time. I don't see other questions. And if there are no other reactions from Eva, Cesare, or Delany herself, I mean, now would be the time to interact. Constanza mentioned another case, the one of Professor Wojciech Sadurski, who's a Polish professor who is now actually on the trial in Poland and is teaching in Australia. He wanted to participate, but apparently, unfortunately, today's webinar conflicted in terms of time, but also he had some lessons. So I think if there is appetite for additional discussion about academic freedom being violated around the world. Certainly Poland would be another example, Brazil, as Costanza has mentioned, and there are a couple of African countries where also the situation is not necessarily the best that we could have around. So I thank you very much for your presentation. One of the issues that was mentioned before by Cesare, and not only is litigation, but it's also the possibility of preparing this parallel report when the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is meeting. We have been able to submit 10 documents already on a variety of issues, and every time there's a different subject on the agenda of those, or at the center of those reports. And every time, not only we are learning more about what anything that has to do with science, so to a certain extent, even if this is a combination of different articles of the Covenant, but also trying to open new doors within the United Nations, because as we understand from what happened this morning in Geneva, some of the issues that, thanks to Cesare's work and his team, have been put to the attention of the United Nations were not be taken into consideration in the past. So we're little by little, there is some jurisprudence to be constructed, and this would be the best way to do it. Some of the information at the center of those parallel reports is taken from an index that the Associazione Luca Cosoni First and Science for Democracy Afterward has been working on since 2009, which collects publicly available information on 5 different topics. Academic freedom is a difficult topic to monitor, but perhaps we can find a good way to feed the index with information and then continue monitoring the situation in the 50 countries that are at the center of the work of the index. So now the time is for Federico Brusadelli, who's a researcher in Chinese history and at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. Welcome. It's the first time we have you with us. You will present the last episode of Humans for the Rule of Law podcast, which is entitled China Ambition in Europe and it has hegemony. And now I say now, and then perhaps at the very end, I'll give the floor to Virginia. Right after this webinar, there is the first assembly of humans that will speak about what humans is. I mean, we heard Laura presenting humans briefly at the very beginning, but this is a network that is mainly working on EU-related issues, as the name says, but wants to also to reach out to a wider audience, or perhaps Europeans that live abroad or non-Europeans that live in Europe. But before, sorry, Federico, we just got another question by Giovanni Capranico. As a biological scientist, I would distinguish between production of scientific results and communication and practical use of them. At present, some countries seem to control and restrict the latter and not the former. Would you agree? Or anybody wants to give it a shot? The separation between production of scientific results and communication and practical use of them. Do you have in the back of your mind any example of such a thing happening, and where and how?
So yes, what he's saying is it makes sense, because the production of scientific knowledge is covered by certain rights, and the dissemination of scientific results of scientific research is covered by others. So so depending on how you want to approach, this is a distinction that is not just academic, but it has practical importance, because it needs to be filed under different heading. Then, of course, at the end of the day, what's the point of producing scientific knowledge if you cannot disseminate it? But that's another thing. So,
or maybe not, because if you're producing a very complicated algorithm to control something, but the only one who produces it is the government, and the only one allowed to use this is the government against the citizen, and that could be perhaps one of the examples that could come to mind from another perspective. But no? Yes?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay. No, I mean, the problem is always here that not only does the need to invest in research and development, but then to make available the results. So the last part of the right to science is to allow the full enjoyment of the benefits of scientific progress and its application to everybody, or not only to the people, members of the party in power or the elite or the rich that live in that specific country. Sorry, Federico, now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this webinar on such an important issue, so often overlooked, I would say. I will basically just provide you with a teaser of the podcast that we have realized together with Simona Bonfante and Octavian Lazer, and I would like to thank them once again for involving me, for inviting me in that podcast. The main topic of the podcast was Xi Jinping's China and his view of the rule of law or rule by law. As I'm a historian and not a jurist, that focus was mainly on Xi Jinping's political thought, on the historical roots of the current Chinese nationalism, I would say, on the discourse by which this renewed Chinese nationalism is spread within the country and on the global stage. So the similarities and differences between these two narratives of China's rise. But then we also discussed at the end of the podcast the issue of academic freedom. Not much in China, because academic freedom in the People's Republic of China is not under threat. It simply doesn't exist and hasn't existed for the last act of some initiatives controlled and financed by the People's Republic of China in foreign countries and in Europe, for what concerns us. Particularly, we talked about the Confucius Institutes. These are institutes that are financed and controlled by the Chinese government, and they have the mission to spread the knowledge of the Chinese language or Chinese culture, but differently from, for example, the Goethe Institute in Germany or the Cervantes Institute in Spain. They are actually hosted within foreign universities, and they also offer important services, I would say, to these universities. In exchange for being hosted, they provide teachers, for example, for language courses. They provide access to fundings or contacts with China and so on. So this has posed a problem, especially in the last few years, also to sinologists. And among the community of China scholars or sinologists, there has been a debate on the impact and the role of these institutes and on this growing self-censorship that we can see among us, among our colleagues, because whenever you want to organize an event, even independently, I mean, at your university in which you want to discuss about the Uyghurs, for example, the situation in Hong Kong or Taiwan, you start asking yourself, so what will the Confucius Institute's reaction be? So there is not yet a direct limitation to academic freedom, but there is the beginning of something, and there is a presence that being connected so evidently to a country in which academic freedom doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist in the form that we consider to be academic freedom, well, then this poses a problem to European scholars, I would say. So what I think we can learn from this phenomenon of the Confucius Institute is two things, I think. First of all, that academic freedom is indeed, I think, a non-negotiable value and a fundamental component of a fully fledged democracy, and is part of what we consider to be a democracy, of our concept of democracy. So academic freedom is a battlefield, I would say, between different understandings of political orders and political structures and political cultures. And it's also, I think, a non-negotiable component of a European identity, or European values should be part of our so-called identity. But at the same time, this experience with China and with the role of the Confucius Institutes tells us that if you want to defend academic freedom, you need money. You need to fund universities, because especially at the moment in which those who threaten academic freedom have plenty of money, it becomes more and more difficult to resist and to protect these values. As Professor Fodor said in her intervention, the CEU was saved by the large endowment that they had, that they could move from Budapest to Wien because they had money. It's very simple. So if you want to protect academic freedom, and if you want to protect it against very rich and powerful enemies, I would say, in conceptual terms, not necessarily in a confrontational way, but you need to sustain it and to protect it also financially. And I think this is something that should be stressed over and over again, besides the importance of the value itself of academic freedom. But how can we actually protect it? It needs money, I would say, first of all. So that's it. I mean, you can listen to the podcast and you will have more details on this debate that we had there.
Great. Thank you very much, Federico. The postcard can be found at humans.eu/China-ambition-Europe-hegemony. Speaking of humans, as said, now I'd like to give the floor to Virginia Fiume, who has a different now, but usually she works for a lot of organizations, and the one she's going to speak about.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks for all of the speakers, because I think it's always very helpful to connect the concepts of fundamental rights and human rights to real life situations. So it was very important for all of us to listen to you. As Marco said, there were many hats, and one of these is I'm the coordinator of Humans, which is one of the co-promoters of this event. And Humans is a project that's becoming more and more reality, of giving a platform for citizens to engage for political reforms in the European Union, for sustainability and democracy, through the activation of instruments of participatory democracy, institutional instruments of participatory democracy. And tonight we will have our assembly, which will be an opportunity to work in the European Union, starting from the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was a project supposed to start 1 year ago to discuss the reforms needed in the European Union, included probably the topic of the rule of law and other rights, and not only. And the assembly is the members' assembly, but is open to anyone. And I hope, I mean, if you are not tired of screen time, you want to join, we will have some very interesting guests as well, among which Violeta Bulc, who was the former EU Commissioner for Transport, who is a very strong advocate of participatory democracy instruments, and many others. So I think the assembly is an opportunity for all of us as citizens, Europeans or not, to try and see what can we do in first person to try and shape the realities around us. I think tonight learning about the reports was quite important, because that is one instrument which requires very high skills from a juridical perspective, but there are other instruments that are available, particularly within the European Union, that can be activated to work on also the issues that we tackled tonight. So I want to invite all of you to follow the assembly if you want, or in general to follow the work of Humans that cooperates strictly with Science for Democracy, if you want to find other ways to engage yourself and try to leave a political mark around Europe and beyond. Thanks a lot.
When we speak about Mark, I am always called in cause. So I would like to thank all the speakers, Marco Gentilly, Cesare Romano, Delaney Hester, Eva Fodor, Latifa Qutz, Federico Brusadelli. I would also like to thank the people behind the scenes that helped us be online for this couple of hours, starting from Virginia that just spoke, Michael Braha, Jessica Sanson, and our interpreters, Monica and Amalia. This was a new topic for Science for Democracy, and I would like to thank again Cesare for his work. It wasn't too much science-oriented, but we had at some point over 90 people with us, so I think it's interesting also for our community. And we hope that soon there's going to be another opportunity to address other issues and perhaps have a follow-up to support the work that Latifa and his friends and colleagues are doing, her friends and colleagues are doing in Turkey, and what the CEU is doing by itself, but certainly with other legal means, or perhaps to share the good news of some interesting developments here and there around the world. Thank you once again to all. Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of the evening or the day if you're on the other side of the globe. Bye-bye.